Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us on our fourth and last session for the Spring BITS Open Research Seminar. I'm Fernando Sotraguardia, project scientist at the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in Social Sciences. If you're new to BITS, we were established in 2012 to improve the credibility of science by advancing transparency, reproducibility, rigor, and ethics in research. We do this by generating evidence about problems and solutions in science through meta research led by BITS investigators and our broader community, by increasing access to open science education through research seminars like this, workshops, and our flagship research transparency and reproducibility trainings, RT2, and by strengthening the scientific ecosystem by developing open science policies, protocols, and platforms to enable open science at scale. The BITS Open Research Seminar is generously supported by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. It's a continuation of a web seminar started last fall to promote and share knowledge about the use of tools and practices for transparency and reproducibility in social science research. This is our last, but not least, session of the spring, where we're going to be hearing about launching the MCC Evidence Platform, why usable evidence tools are critical for impact, led by the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Please see the BITS YouTube channel for all the fall and spring ORS sessions, and make sure you subscribe to our newsletter and following us on Twitter at UCBITS so you don't miss any updates. Thank you for everybody who submitted proposals. We had a very exciting array of proposals from researchers, practitioners, and students around the world. Thank you for our speakers today, and thank you for the Templeton World Charity Foundation. We're grateful to be working with you. And now I would like to give the floor to Casey Dunning from MCC.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fernando. Can you hear me all right? Terrific. I am going to share my screen for a very brief introduction to MCC, but let me first start by thanking BITS and Zeka for hosting MCC, for this opportunity to share this this platform and some of the kind of institutional context behind it. I am Casey Dunning, the Director of Results and Learning at the MCC, and I'm so pleased that you're spending the morning or lunch or evening with us for this conversation. MCC is an independent U.S. federal agency that delivers international aid. We have a singular mission to reduce poverty through economic growth, and we do that with a very particular model that focuses on applying selectivity to country partners and project choices, to promoting country ownership, and to focusing on results. And it's this focus on results that really leads us to a culture and a practice of evidence and open data. Now, I don't expect you to read this full infographic, but I wanted to share it with you because it gives an idea of the evidence and data gates that MCC uses to develop, implement, and evaluate every investment that it undertakes. And I'd also note that we have been internationally recognized in terms of both transparency. So the Aid Transparency Index has ranked us the #1 bilateral donor in the world, and then also evidence use as the #1 US federal agency by results for America. And so it's this evidence based approach that MCC has that I think really sets us apart in terms of other US federal agencies. So for today's time, we will start with a demo of the MCC Evidence Platform. Then we'll have a conversation with a fantastic panel on the institutional history of evidence and data at MCC. Then we'll discuss how we think about and promote the value and use of transparent evidence and open data. And then we have left ample time for audience Q&A. So I hope you'll be thinking of your questions all along the way. You should put them in the chat as you think of them. Happy to have clarifying questions in real time, because we really want to have this be a conversational and informal discussion on evidence and open data. We have a great panel for you. We have Algerlynn Gill, Senior Director of M&E at MCC. We have Schreena Patel, Senior Advisor for Performance Management and Learning at the State Department. Urtina Zeka, an economist with the MCC Compact Development Team in Kosovo. And Jen Sturdy, Deputy Secretary of Evaluation with the California Labor and Workforce Development Agency. And so I'll ask my colleague Jen to come online, and I will stop sharing my screen and I will give the floor to her to do a demo of the MCC Evidence Platform.
Sure. Thanks so much, Casey. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jen Sturdy and happy to join today. I'd say I'm joining as an alumni of both MCC and the M&E department there and the BITS team. So super excited to join and present and talk about this work. I'm going to share my screen. So let me know. Give me the thumbs up. How is it, Fernando? Yeah? Okay. So I'll invite all of you to the MCC Evidence Platform. And actually, I teed up in the chat. Let's see if a link. You're all welcome to join me here. But we thought the best way to kick off the panel would be just a brief kind of tour of this tool. I thought I'd start with the about. So we give a brief description of MCC and the evidence platform and describing exactly its purpose. We've provided some frequently asked questions, really because a lot of folks who might come to the platform don't know how we define a lot of our work. And so we wanted to make sure we were very clear and careful about what the platform was presenting. It centers around knowledge products produced by MCC's evidence activities, largely driven by the independent evaluation portfolio. So we use this section to define the frequently asked questions we imagined we would get when we launched the platform. There's information here about how to establish an account in order to access and download the data. Particularly go through the restricted access data process. We have information here about analysis, citation, and sharing, and then also privacy, of course, what data is being collected about you and how is it used. Next, I'll just take us to the heart of the platform. So when we designed the platform, this is now probably 5 years ago or so, we had to think about really centering it around use, but knowing that there were going to be a lot of very different users. So the first kind of user that we wanted to frame the site around was the one who didn't know what they were looking for. They stumbled upon MCC's evidence platform. They heard about our commitment to open data. They saw us in the Transparency Index, and they just wanted to go to the platform, but didn't know exactly what they were looking for. So we allowed any user who was coming with that approach to access the data and documentation that's shared here through a variety of entry points. So explore the evidence. You can explore by study, so the study as a whole unit, or you could look for just questionnaires if you're only interested in finding questionnaires from studies focused in education, for example. We also thought if you wanted to browse our studies by particular characteristics, such as region or sector. So you can scroll through and really find a variety. Oh, sorry. Oh, we might need to mute someone. But just to let you know, basically this overall site is designed to enter through a variety of means. So if you wanted to enter and just browse by agriculture and irrigation, you would click on that and you'd get a variety of means by which you can look for certain data or documentation materials. So you could enter and look through all 44 studies that we had at MCC on agriculture and irrigation. You could look at just analysis reports, etc. We also wanted to build the platform to think about the policymaker, the program officer who is very specific in or looking for very specific materials. So for example, wanting to find for a specific MCC program, let's say the Indonesia Compact, looking to find all of the final evaluation reports. So when you know specifically what you're looking for, you can also return a result that is very specific, and you can see the 20 analysis reports, that's interim, baseline, or final, related to the specific program you're interested in. Of course, you can further filter down if you realize, oh, actually, I didn't want all of these 20. I'm only interested in the final reports for each of these. So there's a variety of ways to filter that result down. We also imagined not just the policymaker or the program officer who's interested in the documentation, but we imagined, of course, the analyst and the researcher who's interested in potentially examining a full study, whether they're interested in replicating the study or in expanding the original analysis. So when we think about that, we sometimes think about a paper that's published. So take, for example, a recent publication out of the MCC portfolio is a study in Namibia around community-based rangeland management. Now, if you saw this publication, realize this was an MCC project, that's our one challenge, is sometimes connecting the dots from publications back to MCC, but I'm sure most of you are aware of that sort of challenge. But if you know that you're interested in looking for replicating this study in particular, you know enough to find it. So we can find the Namibia Compact, and we can look for, let's say, even just the impact evaluations under the Namibia Compact. So impact evaluations defined for the audience to mean that there is a strong counterfactual. These are the type of studies that many researchers look to leverage to reproduce or expand the analysis. And so you can find the Namibia Compact Community-Based Rangeland and Livestock Management Study. Of course, yep, here we go, loading. And it's a full study page. So we built the platform to not just be able to search by specific data and documentation elements, but to search by the full study. So you can also land on a study page and you're able to download all of the files associated with that study, from the design report to the questionnaires to the data sets themselves. So I will, I think, wrap up the demo there, but happy to answer any specific questions and turn it back over to Casey for the panel discussion. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's always, I find so much more helpful to kind of have someone walk through it in real time. So it becomes less of a theoretical and more of a concrete practical tool. And I also appreciate you kind of highlighting the ways it can respond to the needs of different users and the objectives that can come out of it. So I think let me have the rest of the panel come on the grid view. Perfect. And Algerlynn, I would love to turn to you now. We had Jen walk us through this tool, but I'd love to have you kind of talk through the practice at MCC and the kind of context that surrounds this tool and open data at MCC.
Sure, thank you. And it was exciting to see Jen show the Namibia community-based rangeland and livestock management example, which is one near and dear to my heart. But as Casey mentioned early on, MCC's focus on results is one of the key features that distinguishes us from other international development agencies. And from early on, one of the ways that MCC has operationalized that focus on results was to require that every compact, and compacts are our larger grant agreements, have a monitoring and evaluation plan. So that requirement was later extended to our threshold programs, which are our smaller grant agreements. And those monitoring and evaluation, or M&E plans, lay out our strategy for monitoring and evaluating our programs. There's a monitoring component, and that focuses on our continuous process of measuring progress towards our objectives. And that takes place during implementation and centers around quarterly reports that we receive from our country partners. We also require that each project we invest in be evaluated by a third party to independently assess whether we achieve the results we set out to achieve. And our comprehensive approach to M&E is predicated on three underlying principles. The first is accountability, and that relates to our obligation to measure the extent to which the programs we fund achieve what we set out to achieve. And that commitment stems directly from our authorizing legislation, which requires us to state the specific objectives that we agree with our country partners that we want to achieve, and to also lay out transparently what benchmarks we'll use to measure progress towards those objectives. The second principle underlying our work is learning. And that relates to our commitment to identifying why an investment did or did not achieve its stated objectives. And we use that information to inform any needed changes to ongoing projects or to inform the development of future projects. The last principle is transparency, and that relates to our commitment to publicly release information related to our results. And that includes our quarterly monitoring data, the evaluation results, so those analysis reports that Jen was just showing, and the underlying microdata that are used to estimate those results. So several years into MCC's existence, we had a robust pipeline of evaluations underway and a bunch that were beginning to close. Around the same time, as part of the Open Government Initiative under the Obama administration, we committed as an agency to make a number of microdata sets publicly available. And despite our ambitious commitments, at that time, we had no way to disseminate microdata or related evaluation materials. We worked with a group of experts in the field of microdata dissemination to develop the original MCC evaluation catalog, so the predecessor to the evaluation platform that we Jen just demoed. And that catalog became functional in 2013. So for about 9 years, that catalog was our primary mechanism for disseminating all of our evaluation documentation and underlying microdata. And all the different materials that Jen showed you were made available through that catalog, except for the restricted access data, which I'll talk about in a second. The evaluation catalog was huge in terms of facilitating accountability and transparency, but it was developed based on a tool that had a different purpose and wasn't designed to be as user-friendly as our new platform. And some of the key limitations were that the searchability was really limited. We couldn't track the users of our evaluation materials or data sets. And this notion of having restricted access data to facilitate replication and further learning we just couldn't accommodate that functionality with the original catalog. And our goal to resolve those limitations and improve the usability of MCC's core evaluation products is what led us to the evidence platform. As Jen described in her remarks, it's taken a ton of hard work and commitment to get us there. And our leadership's deep commitment to the principles of accountability, learning, transparency that underpin our work was integral to moving this initiative forward. And I'll talk a bit more about sort of the importance of all of this at MCC and give some examples a bit later.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview, Algerlynn. I'd like to turn to Urtina next, coming to us from Pristina, to kind of offer the context of our country partners and the creation of data and how that kind of open data partnership works.
Thank you, Casey. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here as the economist of the Compact Development Team, but my experience with MCC dates back to when the MCC was doing its threshold program in Kosovo, so about 4 years ago. Kosovo is still in the development stage of the compact, but MCC has already established itself in Kosovo as a very credible institution, and a big part of it was transparency and reliability. Just to give you a context on how data is created in Kosovo, data is collected and made public mostly through government institutions and bodies, such as the Agency of Statistics, Tax Authority, Customs, the Central Bank, and so forth. Some data are collected more frequently, such as labor force surveys, but others are collected less frequently, such as the population census, which has been about 13 years since it was last collected. In terms of open data, Kosovo ranks the 98th out of 187 states in the open data inventory in 2022. And for comparison, the US ranks the 22nd. I know that we're not at the really low end of the distribution, but there are all sorts of open data. For example, Kosovo makes available aggregated data, and it does so periodically. Even there are donor agencies such as MCC who publish data, but in a more sporadic manner. They're not that consistent, so updating the data every year, for example. But one thing that Kosovo is still behind is access to data sets. And that sometimes can be difficult for a society that tries to hold the decision makers accountable, because the decisions can be through aggregated data, they can be questioned, but not the institutions who make or who publish the aggregated data. So for example, what if a methodology that the Agency of Statistics was outdated and the researchers cannot challenge that because they don't have access on how the data was created to begin with. Regarding the opportunities and challenges in our experience in working with MCC as a US federal agency, both the challenges and opportunities have one element in common, which is the demand for quality. MCC has introduced this demand for quality through whether that be data quality reviews, trainings of the staff, and so forth. And that can be a double-edged sword, because a lot of effort has to be put in place, not just in terms of manpower, but also in terms of training, quality assurance, and so forth. The resources in developing countries can sometimes be limited towards this task, but at least local organizations, even though they cannot meet the standard, they can at least recognize the limitations of their studies better. Now, we had this case as an example with a compact country team. We were analyzing the energy poverty in Kosovo, and some statistics gathered by local organizations would have a level of energy poverty at 80%, while the World Bank would have another level at half that, so 40%. And we were deciding on the cost-benefit analysis, and it was very difficult to use one of these statistics to make a judgment on what the benefits were. So we decided to rely on the World Bank statistics, but we had to make a trade-off because the data was a bit older. So it was a bit like 4 or 5 years old. So there is a trade-off that you need to make. It either comes in terms of high costs, referring to older data, or as MCC has often done, to collect data from the beginning or from scratch. We're in the process of, for example, gathering data for labor force in the energy sector, and the demand for labor in the energy sector, and we have had to gather the data ourselves because such information did not exist. But at least, while this is costly, at least it produces reliable results that Algerlynn has been talking about. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Urtina. And I want to, I really appreciate your points about kind of the importance of quality, and it kind of all starts from there. So let me turn back to Jen to kind of expound on those points and how we think about those points with regards to open data at MCC.
Yeah, I just want to kind of bring those two together. I mean, all three, you know, how did we get to this platform, and how do we get the data into the hands of folks like Urtina? And I think, you know, it's really important to think about a platform like this and getting to this state. It took an institutional response at MCC. As Algerlynn says, you know, MCC had a commitment to results built into its model. So we had a commitment to, you know, the labor force surveys, the sort of, you know, willingness to pay surveys in pre-compact, pre-program timeframes. We had our commitment to independent evaluations. And we also had the commitment to making that data public and being as open and transparent from the beginning as possible. But as Algerlynn said, without really designing what that looked like in advance, we found ourselves, you know, in 2012, ready to release reports, ready to release data, but not knowing where they were going to go. How were we going to, you know, put these up in a way where we had a clear clearance and review process? We knew where the materials were going, and we knew that people would be able to find those materials. So I think, you know, recognizing that it really takes an institutional response. And by that, I mean, it's not just a technological solution. It takes, you know, M&E, it took IT and security, you know, staff, it took legal staff, it took our congressional and public affairs, you know, and communications staff to really come together and build a platform that could accomplish a lot of different objectives, not least of which are, you know, transparency and reproducibility for this study materials. I would also add, it really took an approach to establishing strong internal processes. And processes, I mean, you know, guidance around defining for our contractors, this data is going to be released. How do we think about protection of confidentiality, informed consent to the participant populations? You know, having a process where from the very beginning, we're building transparency into the study workflow, the data workflow. All the way to, you know, establishing a body within MCC, the Disclosure Review Board, that's responsible for reviewing and clearing on, you know, the data that goes up, in order to get that right balance between our commitment to transparency, but also ensuring that we're minimizing any risk to privacy. So an institutional response is kind of how we get here.
That's super helpful, Jen. And I want to come back in the next round of questions with kind of your thoughts now a bit removed about kind of how we've done on all this. But let me turn to Schreena for kind of a broader context here. So kind of lifting up a bit of thinking about open data and evidence in a larger US government, federal context, but also as it relates to recent legislation that was passed.
Thanks, Casey, and hi, everyone. I'll mainly be speaking from my experience at MCC, where I was leading the evaluation practice for the last 4 years or so, since I very recently moved over to the State Department, but I can try and bring in a little bit of perspective from there as well. And to that point, I think across government, we're in a pretty exciting moment for evidence-based policymaking, thanks in large part to pushes from legislation like the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act, and more recently, I think in 2018, the Evidence Act. And the Evidence Act in particular requires changes to how federal government manages and uses the information that it collects. And more specifically, it emphasizes more strategic use of data, and it requires agencies to develop and maintain an open data plan. And that plan is supposed to describe efforts to make government data open and public. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that only came out in 2018. So of course, it's a slow and steady change across government, but those are important pillars that various government agencies are trying to align with. And MCC was kind of, as Algerlynn said, since 2012 has been already working in this direction. So I would say MCC is probably pretty far ahead of where some other parts of government are. The other exciting thing is that there is interest now at the highest levels in just having in data and evidence and using it. So having confidence up front that a particular policy makes sense in a given context. So maybe being able to use some of that evaluation data from another project to really understand, okay, that's the baseline now for another project that we might be investing in. And also just in really understanding whether our existing policy approaches have worked. And so there's just tons of data that's being collected in a often in a very decentralized way that can be used for both these kind of forward-looking policymaking and backward-looking reflection on what worked, which can also then, feed into forward-looking. And so I think that's where the platform does a really nice job of bringing that decentralized data collection together. What all of us from the MCC current and alumni sit in either the M&E division or Casey's in the same department. And so we're talking a lot about evaluation data, but there's tons of other data that's collected at MCC. And that is still, an opportunity for more of that data to be made public. So feasibility studies that MCC does ahead of investing in a project, or other data collection to inform the economic analysis, like all of those types of data sets. I think the platform is a great tool to bring it all together and provide data and evidence that can be used for various purposes. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Schreena. I would now like to turn to kind of the second round of the panel and really focus on how MCC and hopefully other institutions think about the value and the use of transparent evidence and open data. So before I turn to my first question, though, I will once again remind you, if you have questions for the panel, do please add them to the chat. We'll have time in a bit for you to ask them directly of the panel if you so choose, but do please be thinking of those. So Algerlynn, I would like to turn to you for this first question, as we're thinking about kind of the value of and use. And I think Jen helpfully laid it out in the demo of the evidence platform of the different types of users that the platform can respond to. And so I was hoping that you could kind of speak to how MCC values open data and specific thinking about kind of the practitioner and the policymaker and those types of use cases that MCC is targeting.
Sure. Well, we value open data as part of, those three principles that I'd mentioned early on. So open data gets at our kind of commitment to transparency, and that really does help facilitate our commitments to accountability and learning. So we, have the obligation to share what it is that we've committed to do with MCC funds and report against that. And we have a responsibility to do the best development work that we can. So we take the kind of results that comes from our accountability work to facilitate our learning to do the best work that we can. And we publish a ton of evidence and really work hard to encourage and facilitate use. So in addition to the kind of, direct deliverables from our evaluations and the underlying microdata that are available on the platform, we do some work to kind of aggregate and synthesize the evidence that we're producing. One example is in a series of papers we refer to as principles into practice papers. And those are papers that are produced across our agency, but the ones that M&E is typically involved in are centered around our evaluation practice, at least thus far, and we produce them when we achieve a critical mass of evaluation results in a specific sector or related to a specific type of investment. And we work hand in hand with staff in our operations department. So the people who are leading on the development and implementation of our projects alongside our country partners. And the principles into practice papers really reflect on MCC's experiences implementing and evaluating our programs, and also the evaluation results themselves. And the goal of those papers is to draw broad lessons to improve MCC programming and also the way we approach M&E. We've published 4 of those evaluation-related principles into practice papers thus far, the first being in 2012. You've probably gathered from both Schreena and Jen thus far. 2012 was a really critical year for MCC, and that was the first year that we published principles into practice paper. It was in the agriculture sector, centered around what we call our first 5 agriculture evaluations. The second one was in the road sector, published in 2017. Schreena actually co-authored that. The third was published in 2020, related to technical and vocational education and training. And the last one was in the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector, published in 2021, also co-authored by Schreena. And we published an issue brief on general education earlier this year, so not quite a full principles into practice paper, but one will be coming out related to kind of building on that initial issues brief soon. And each of these principles into practice paper really reflects MCC's commitment to learning from the measurement of our results. And some of the examples of how this learning has influenced our practice is, so the agriculture paper influenced MCC's evaluation practice broadly. So one of the things, we realized we didn't have any place to post our evaluation deliverables. But even more central than that, there was learning about the way we approach investments across the board, the way we approach evaluations across the board, the importance of thinking about kind of the connections between, hard investments in infrastructure and what we might call, soft investments in things like training. The roads lessons influenced a complete restructuring of our ongoing roads evaluations, and also influenced investments in Nepal and Cote d'Ivoire, which both prioritized road maintenance over rehabilitation, which was a shift in our practice. The WASH lessons influenced the careful framing of project objectives and the need for coordinating with water utilities on data collection in Mongolia and Timor-Leste. Another way that we're aggregating evidence through a different platform is our sector results and learning pages. And those are pages on MCC's website. And Casey, if maybe you can drop the link in the chat, or I can later. And we launched those pages in 2021. And the goal is, again, to encourage the use of our results and learning. And there are 6 pages that are organized around our 6 main sectors. So that's agriculture and irrigation, education, energy, land, transportation, and WASH. And those pages provide an overview of each sector. They describe programs and common intervention areas in each sector. They aggregate some data on some of our key performance indicators. They offer a curated set of evaluation results and links to our full set of evaluation results in each sector. And one of the things that is really exciting that these pages do is that we publish a full database of all lessons that have been identified through our evaluation process. So as one of the steps in kind of completing our evaluations, MCC staff gather internally and reflect on what those evaluations are telling us, what the lessons are coming out that should influence MCC practice going forward. Part of our kind of commitment to transparency is that we publish those lessons. So you can find on the evidence platform where we have MCC learning documents. They're PDFs. And what we do on the Sector Results and Learning page is we take each of those lessons out of those PDFs and we make them available through kind of a filterable database that's right there on our website. And our staff tag those lessons. So you can search by, program design, program management, evaluation design, evaluation management. So those are kind of 4 phases of programs and evaluations. And then within each of those phases, we have other kind of key topics that you can use to find learning that might be relevant to your own specific needs. So just in wrapping, I wanted to underscore our commitment to learning with a practical example. And that's that all teams working to design new country programs have to demonstrate to our management how they've incorporated learning from prior MCC investments. And one of the roles M&E leads play on program development teams is to bring evidence from MCC prior investments to the table for use by the full development team. Both the principles into practice papers and these filterable lessons and easy links to our evaluation findings through the Sector Results and Learning pages really help to facilitate that process and better position us to improve our development assistance going forward. And open data allows us to kind of make this all open to the public and any other kind of policymakers out there working on similar things to both kind of look and see how is MCC walking the walk, but also use all of this information to inform your own programming.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Algerlynn. And you also, I don't know if you knew it or not, but actually answered one of the first questions that we've already gotten on the types of synthesis and meta analysis that MCC undertakes. So thank you for highlighting those points. And the second part of the question was examples of how the data is used by external researchers. And so here, let me nicely turn to Urtina to discuss how researchers use MCC data and her specific experience with that.
Yeah, that's true. When I referred back to my experience with the Threshold program, I was referring to a specific experience that I had as a student. I was doing a master's program in development economics at Sussex University. And I wanted to study a topic that was relevant to my country. One of the prevailing issues in my country is the high unemployment and the high duration of unemployment. And I decided to study this with one of the labor force surveys that the Agency of Statistics posts more frequently. But when I went to check the data set, it wasn't there. So the data was only in an aggregated form. And I asked, turns out that the only way I could access the data is through their offices. And I had to go through these approval processes and whatnot, which I was willing to do if I wasn't in a lockdown and during COVID. So I was stuck in the UK and couldn't travel back to access the data. And the policy from the Agency of Statistics was clear. They couldn't send the data to anyone. So I had to revert to either using aggregated data or using data from another country. I didn't want to use like super old data from 10 years ago. So upon further inspection, I came across the MCC's Threshold Labor Force Survey from 2017. Back then, it was the MCC evaluation catalog that I used. But I had access to the whole report, the summary report, the aggregated data, but also to the data set. And that was important to me because I used the data. I could manipulate it as really easily. The data was easy to use. It had around 32,000 observations and had plenty of variables which I could choose from to analyze the nexus I was researching. The data package had a user manual. It had the full survey in both official languages, Albanian and Serbian, but also in English. manipulations to variables were all explained, such as labels, stop coding, and all of that. And also the quality assurance measures were explained in great detail, in like 5 or more pages, from the training of the enumerators to the recording or the supervision that they had, random supervision in this case. And also because, let's say, some statistics varied widely between the labor force of the National Agency of Statistics and MCC, there was this paragraph explaining these differences between the statistics. For example, the unemployment rate was about 10 percentage points lower in MCC's labor force survey, and turns out that MCC took into account informal employment as well, and the Agency of Statistics didn't. So it made a lot of sense why this discrepancy occurred, but also as a researcher, I found it quite useful to trust one or the other statistics, and it had grounds on why I could trust one or the other. That to me was really important, especially because the data set was clean and ready to use, and all the labels were so clear that I used maybe 1 week to manipulate the data set, but that's it. My colleagues used about 2/3 of the time just to clean the data and then analyze it. But me, I could just directly use the data and focus on a really in-depth analysis. And that I feel like I got a really robust results. I could do sensitivity analysis. I could cross-check my results with other countries. So it was a more in-depth experience, in-depth research, rather than having to go through data cleaning for the majority of the time I had available. So open data enables researchers like me to enrich the decision-making, enrich the resources for decision-making. But also I had this other experience where we were told to replicate a paper during my studies, and we could only, of course, replicate the papers whose data set that they used was available. What this made me realize is if I have the data set, I can hold those researchers more accountable, because I realized that if I just change one of the variables or just use a different procedure from what the researchers use, I get completely different results. And this made me, as a researcher, when I turned to using the data myself, made me more wary of doing sensitivity analysis myself, but also thinking that because the data set is available, everyone can replicate my study, and they will hold me accountable for what I publish. So it made me more mindful of how careful I am to analyze each of these variables. So it's not just important on enabling researchers to produce documents, but also to hold them accountable for what they produce, and it increases the accuracy of the results. So that was my experience.
Thanks so much, Urtina. And I appreciate that we kind of keep coming back to these themes of accountability and learning, but what you rightly emphasize is the accountability of having good research and high quality kind of open data to have high quality research behind it. Schreena, I would like to turn to you now. We have kind of hit on all the on many points around use and ensuring that the data is high quality, is on a usable platform that is intuitive to a user, but this requires kind of emphasis and prioritization from an agency level, and sometimes there are challenges and pushback to that. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and I'm hoping I can also ask you, we had a great question on how we think about the cost effectiveness of making the data and other knowledge products ready for publication. So I was hoping you might weave that in as well.
Sure.
Over to you.
Yeah. So, okay, from my perspective, and that is the perspective, like I said before, that most of what's on the platform is our evaluation reports and data and documentation. So from the perspective of kind of overseeing the team's processes to get to that very detailed set of documentation that Urtina talked about, that's kind of where I'm coming from talking through a challenge. And so I would say the biggest challenge, and for MCC, but also for any other organization that's contemplating its approach to open data, is really how best to frame the aim, and both the aim and the scope of open data at your organization, and then balance the resources required to fulfill that vision. And so I'll pick back up on that point in terms of cost effectiveness later. And so it relates to Jen's earlier point about the institutional response. And so yes, MCC, I think, being frank, had like a general institutional response that we will do open data, but then, as we've already talked about, that then required more thinking over time to really home into, or really just better define, what exactly does that mean, and is it simply just posting materials to a website, which I would say that the first iteration, the evaluation catalog, wasn't as simple as just putting materials up. There was more thought that went into that, but still, it didn't quite, there were always critiques, and it didn't quite meet some users' needs. And so there's just kind of like a series of additional questions you can ask yourself as an organization, and that you can add on to your procedures as an organization to really achieve kind of the holy grail of open data and what we're trying to achieve through open data. And so open data wasn't an easy matter to operationalize at MCC, and it really did require a pretty robust set of changes and procedures and guidance, which Jen alluded to, that had to be managed over many years to institutionalize. And so I think at this point we're a decade later to the very beginnings, to the start of open data, at least from the evaluation kind of microdata perspective at MCC. And so just kind of reflecting on some of the bumps along the way, I do think first and foremost, an organization should be really clear about the role and the purpose of open data for you, because there are so many different ways that you can think about just complying with an open data requirement or even an open data vision. And so back to Algerlynn's point about our principles at MCC, is that purpose accountability? That might push you in the direction of replication, which is something that we did at MCC. Is it learning? Because that might push you to publish everything possible under the sun so that others can make use of whatever nuggets of information that you have. And or is it transparency, which might push you sort of closer in the direction of where we started with the open data, the evaluation catalog, which was kind of, okay, let's at least put out everything that we've already produced. And then you want to think about who exactly is the target. Is it to help make your materials more accessible to an internal audience, so that everyone at MCC, or let's say everybody at a much bigger scale, everybody at the State Department, could really access the evidence that you have available? Or is there a public good argument that you want to make it accessible to completely not yet identified? You might have some ideas, which Jen was talking about, the ideas of users that led to the development of the platform, but still, is it students like Urtina? Is it other practitioners? Who is it? And so, and how important is that public good argument? Because really that argument in particular puts a lot of requirements then on how you think about preparing and publishing your materials. And so, yeah, each of these different scenarios has different implications for the documentation and the processing of your data sets and your materials. And particularly if you're a government agency, there are various requirements, and probably at all academic institutions as well, but various laws that you have to comply with to make your materials public, which also adds another layer of cost and effort to consider as you put materials out. The point really is that it's really critical to clarify the purpose or aim so that your organization can really adequately assess costs and trade-offs, because that's something that I definitely reflected on, like probably midway through that arc of that 10-year change management process, that had we really understood how much it was going to, I'm not even talking necessarily financial resources, but just you should see some of our process diagrams in the M&E team at MCC to actually get from completing an evaluation to publishing all of the data sets. And the amount of like sort of your own internal accountability mechanisms and quality control mechanisms to make sure that all of our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted, to make sure that everything that Urtina was able to take advantage of is actually there. Because even as she was talking through that, I mean, anyone in a like data commissioner or data research organization was probably thinking like, oh, like all of the steps that it took for that unit to put out that labor force survey for Kosovo. And so, I mean, also just not to mention that in order to really have a good open data system, you have to make sure that you have high quality data to begin with. And Urtina also referenced that a little bit. So, I mean, this goes without saying, and it's not something that's solely required by open data, but it's something you have to think a bit harder about when you are making data sets public. Like, do you actually have robust systems to ensure that you're collecting and producing high quality data, to ensure that you're documenting your data in a way that's credible? And to Urtina's point as well, that one of MCC's uses of transparency was that kind of accountability loop back to our independent evaluators to sort of, it does act as a little bit of a threat that like everything's going to go public, so just hold yourself accountable a little bit more. So yeah, that's really an important factor as well, to just make sure that you have your basics in place first, all your procedures related to data and evidence production, before you even can think about like all of the different layers that are required to make that data public. And so, when you think about then going external, there's just some additional layers that you might have to start considering. So first, not just data sets, but if you're thinking about reports, those reports might need a bit of extra polish or just an external communications lens to them to feel comfortable making them public for external consumption. So that's just another thing to consider. The documentation of your data and analysis for other users that would be required for people, let's say, who aren't familiar with the ins and outs of MCC, is something that you might have to, we sort of considered as we produced more materials that we made public. And then even just getting down to really basics of, you have to produce metadata for all of the materials that you make public to make sure that they're searchable. We have this extremely powerful engine of the evidence platform, but the searchability is only as good as the metadata that each individual M&E lead is inputting every time that they upload a report or some other materials to the platform. And then even more nitty-gritty, procedures for naming and uploading files. Again, seems really basic, but something that has to be managed. And Algerlynn and I can speak to this in particular over the last year as we were migrating our files over from the original evaluation catalog over to the evidence platform. It sometimes took hours to be able to actually like put one file. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration. Let's say hours to like fully migrate one study over to the platform. And so again, it may not be a large sort of financial tag to like cost item for doing all of this, but it does require really good, strong procedures and guidance, which Jen had talked about before, starting with the evaluation scope of work and putting the markers there that the research firm is going to have to produce their data sets in a particular way and documentation associated with it, all the way through actually getting those, like doing quality control on those materials, quality control with an external lens, and then actually putting it on the platform with the appropriate metadata. I know I'm talking for a while, but there were a couple more things I wanted to say. So Jen and I used to talk, so okay, you have an open data system and which is kind of thinking about, okay, let's at least put everything that we have out to the public. But then something that Jen and I used to debate a lot when both of us were back at MCC is, what about actually encouraging more use? So we still invest a lot of just, let's say, putting what we produce out, but it's not, I mean, I think Jen can answer the question about tracking the data, the use rather of the evidence platform a little bit better than I could. So we'll come back to that question, but still, it's not like we're getting hundreds of requests for data every single day. And you might think actually, given how much work we put into putting the data out, we'd want to see a lot more use, but encouraging use then requires even more investment. So thinking about tracking use, thinking about maybe doing open data challenges, which MCC did a couple of years, or probably about 5 years ago at this point, to encourage students to use the data, or other competitions or cash prizes, or other just ways to make the data more findable and usable. And so that's just yet another layer to think about. Again, if we're trying to reach that holy grail of like public open data as a public good, there's just a lot of different layers of additional thinking and strategy, and then resources that are required to make it happen. And I think we all agree that it's a worthy cause, but it is something that I wanted to share to reflect on, that you have to really calibrate the right balance for your particular organization, given your own constraints, whether they're financial or even just staff constraints. Oh, sorry. So then in terms of cost effectiveness, I think that is actually an area that we've never been able to really quantify that. And it's something that like I said, I think and I would turn to the others from MCC on the panel as well. I think we embarked on open data at MCC kind of with, okay, like this is important, let's do it. And it was difficult to really reflect on truly how much, I mean, I could tell you for our various evaluation contracts, how much it was costing per evaluation to process the data to make it public. And those were very high amounts. And then they kind of got lower as we internally at MCC got our procedures more clear and kind of were able to forecast up front for the evaluators what they needed to do, so that it wasn't kind of such a jumble at the end, which it was in the very early days. But still, in terms of like, how many different users are actually taking advantage of a particular data set, I can't say that we have really done that in a robust manner. And MCC is a very fortunate government agency in the sense that results and accountability and learning and transparency are baked into our model. And so we were always able to argue for the funds that were needed, let's say, to build something like the evidence platform. But yeah, I actually don't have a great answer for that question. And it does get back to what I considered, I felt very like it was a big challenge to think through in my role at MCC as well. Like, is it actually worth it? And I think in theory, very much so. And in practice, it actually takes a lot of resources to make it worth it. And so then you're sort of in a cost benefit loop there.
Yes, a lot of good points and food for thought, and kind of concrete advice on if you're going down this path, here are the things you should think about. Jen, let me turn to you for one last question from me before we turn to some great questions in the chat. And I'd like to put you on the spot to kind of respond to the challenges and issues Schreena laid out, if there's anything that kind of resonates with you or anything you'd like to add there. And then also key ways that you have found in your long career at multiple institutions of ways to build and demonstrate the value of open data and evidence.
Yeah, it's probably the hardest question. I don't know that I have an answer, so I can talk a little bit. I mean, as an alumni of the Disclosure Review Board and, the MCC M&E team, I mean, it's very easy to track costs. It's very easy to see them and see how much more they are than you expected. For example, preparing a data package for publication on the evidence platform, if you're looking for a public use, data file, working through a de-identification process where MCC, the research team, everyone feels that they've abided by the promises of confidentiality, it would be, for many data sets, a long, arduous process with multiple reviews, because cost is not just the financial cost. Cost is also risk, and risk to the researchers, risk to the study participants whose sensitive data is potentially going up there, and we have a responsibility to protect. So it can become very easy to only see the costs, especially when the value, I think, as everyone at BITS, anyone here knows, it is hard to quantify, right? And there's at least two categories of benefit. There is transparency for transparency's sake. We argue that this is important. And why is it important? It's important because the results of these studies are being used to inform how big dollars are being programmed. And being transparent about the results is just as important as being transparent about how those results were produced. And so there is value in transparency, and we don't know how to quantify that. And then there's, I think, this other layer, which is all of the Urtinas of the world. You know, that story is our golden grail. I feel like when we started, you know, working toward publishing the evaluation findings and data back in 2012, you know, we imagined that those costs would pay off through the benefit of many Urtinas, right? Young professional researchers who are looking to access the data, expand the analysis, replicate the analysis. And, you know, to answer, I think it was Carson asked the question in the chat, you know, do we have many more examples or examples of meta-analyses where other researchers have used the data we've put out there? Not really. And I think we ask ourselves a few questions. Is it because no one is using the data? Well, that gets into, we need to promote it better. We need to understand why. I mean, some studies are so specific to time and place and population. Of course, there's only so much you can do with the data. But you know, some data's in aggregate in a meta-analysis can actually respond to other questions, right? And so why don't we see use, at least the way that we thought we would? Is it because people don't know that this data is here? We need to promote it more. So hence a panel like this, and hopefully reaching broader audiences and inviting, you know, very diverse research communities to this data to say, is it useful? Can we do anything else with it? And we've done that, as Schreena said, through, you know, open data challenges early on. But again, that was viewed as one more cost for us to try and find the benefit. I think the other point, though, that I would make is we also just couldn't know what we couldn't know and didn't know what we didn't know. In my last year at MCC, when we were working on the evidence platform and working on this issue, is it worth it? What is the benefit? I basically went on Google Scholar and did all I could to try and find, is anyone using our data? And we just don't know it. And the answer was yes. There were other publications we were finding where maybe we got a citation or a little note in the acknowledgements based on MCC's, you know, final data from 2013. But it wasn't always there. And, you know, we hope by within the platform, you know, one more problem you're trying to solve is just give a citation. I mean, that's, as we know, in open data, we don't have data citation standards. And so within the evidence platform, working with our data steward, you know, partner ICPSR on the development of this platform, one critical component was every knowledge product, including the data, gets a standard citation. Does this help us track better? Does it help us understand more the actual use if it's occurring? Because it's still a big if. But I think it's, you know, us not being able to exactly know the benefit, it's complicated. And it's because it's also, how do you put a price on, you know, Urtina having a very successful, you know, analytic project in her master's program when she needed it, right? And so I don't have much more to say yet on that point, but I'll stop there because it's complicated and I don't think we have the answers. Some of it is technical, like provide a citation. Okay, we're doing that. Does that help? But I think, you know, I would say, as a proud alumni of BITS and continued investment in, you know, the broader commitment to research transparency and reproducibility in social science, yes, it's worth it. You know, and some of that is, you know, I guess codified through accolades, you know, for MCC. So you get a pat on the back with the transparency index. That's a benefit. You know, I think it's not the type of benefit we're really interested in, though. And so how do we do more to understand what those benefits are and be able to share them? Because at the end of the day, I think MCC, as Schreena said, it is funded to deliver on these commitments in a way that not, you know, other agencies aren't, or small research teams aren't, right? And so you know, finding a way to better articulate and understand the benefit, I think, is really important.
Absolutely. Very well said. As the person who took the Google Scholar search baton from you with your departure at MCC, it is it continues, and I would say about every 2 months we find a article or a peer reviewed piece that has used MCC data in a way to further research. But we are hoping with the standard citations and the DOIs to kind of have that become a more standardized process. And so this gets to Carson's kind of question about tracking for our public access data. So far, this is kind of the best workaround we found in terms of how people are using it. And of course, that's only in a in something that's published. And so there's a lot of use that happens that isn't published, doesn't make it onto these various platforms. And so there's that issue. We do, however, with our restricted use data, researchers are required to offer some very brief information about their home institution, the purpose of the research, in order to access our virtual data enclave and use the restricted use data. So for that subset of data, we actually will be able to better track who's accessing the platform and how they're using it. And one other point I wanted to raise here is, as Jen noted, some of this data is hyper specific and has kind of very specific uses. But even when we do match a researcher with who needs this hyper specific data, like in Urtina's example, I think you said it took months to find this data. It was really hard to find. And so even when we have this perfect marriage of need and use, we still need to be doing a better job of getting the platform and the existence of the data out there. And so there's kind of all these intertwining things that we have to be thinking about in terms of the ultimate use of the data. Please keep adding your questions. I want to turn to Graham's question. I hope I'm saying your name right. I didn't know if you wanted to come off mute or I can read it. Entirely up to you, but it's a great question.
Yeah, thanks so much for this presentation. I wasn't sure, I'm not sure whether this is the right group who was working on these evaluation briefs, but I'm just curious about, it sounds like the tracking is difficult, but which of these products are being used by decision makers, either these awesome detailed analysis reports or the evaluation briefs? And then particular on the evaluation briefs, you know, a lot of different organizations are doing this kind of thing. And so I was just curious about your kind of thinking about what should go in there, the mix of like results and contextual information and methods, and whether those are, what the reception of those has been like. Thanks.
Absolutely. Great question. I am looking at Algerlynn and Schreena, happy to kick off the conversation as someone who was there at the beginning, but I will defer to the panel first.
I can start us off. Yeah, we've got 2 of the 3 people who spearheaded the evaluation brief effort on the line, me and Casey, and Algerlynn is continuing to advance them still at MCC. But the briefs came out of kind of a recognition that let's talk specific first and foremost at MCC. We were really thinking about our own immediate audience of policymakers within MCC. And there was either through critiques we received from our colleagues at MCC and also our own reflection, we recognized that the hundreds of pages long evaluation reports were not being read cover to cover, and just were not serving the purpose of feeding key information to decision makers. And so that was the motivation behind the evaluation briefs. And we had even had another version called the summary of findings, which was a longer summary version of the report, maybe like 10 or so pages. And even that was still considered too long. Even from other stakeholders on the Hill, they would tell us this is too much information, like we need a shorter summary. So that's where the briefs came from. And so therefore I would posit that they are being used. Actually, I think we saw from after the dissemination of the briefs, so the launch of the briefs, that there was a lot more reference around the agency by our sector colleagues who were the ones making more of the design decisions around programming, that they were much more likely to reference an evaluation brief versus go and try to read through a longer report. And we structured the briefs very carefully to try to give different information to different audiences in the quickest way possible. So like the first page of the brief has the header and subheader, which give you the sense of, okay, bottom line, what did this project try to achieve? And then what was the key takeaway from it? The first page also gives you a summary of just the key findings from the evaluation and the nature of the intervention. And then if you go, each brief is 4 pages. If you go in further, it tells you the actual evaluation questions that were being answered. It gives you more detailed information about the answers to those evaluation questions. And then the piece which we felt strongly about but had to get relegated to the end was the methods, because we didn't want people to not understand the methods as they were interpreting the findings. But after some iterations where we had that up front, we were persuaded to move it to the last page. And then we also include the lessons, like the key lessons. Algerlynn alluded to this before, that after every evaluation report closes, there's a moment of reflection on what can we take away from the findings of the evaluation that we can actually put into action going forward at MCC. So that's also included in the brief. I don't know if I didn't cover anything else, but Casey or Algerlynn, feel free.
No, I think that's great. And I would we have seen a pretty significant uptick in kind of use and reference and downloads. And if it sounds like you may have opened one, which is great, but they're intentionally designed to kind of to be the tip of the iceberg. And so links to the full report, making sure that a user who wants to know more about any of the components has easy access. And then I would also note something interesting that's happened on the methods point is that it's forced us to get smarter about how we talk about our methods. And we have these, I think, very interesting infographics that are hope to kind of convey sometimes very complex methods in easy to understand infographics and prose. And so I think that's also been a real benefit. Not only are we talking about the findings in more jargon-free and easier to understand language, but we're talking about the methods and that aspect as well. On the who's using what to make decisions, Algerlynn, I wondered if you already covered this in your discussion on the principles into practice reports, but it's certainly the analysis reports and the full evaluation reports that go into the kind of synthesis of findings that we use to make decisions on practice. I would offer not the briefs, but I didn't know if you wanted to come in on that point or not, since you already covered it too.
Sure. So the evaluation reports do get read and they get read also by, I think, people outside of just the teams preparing the evaluation briefs. But I do think that the briefs really go a long way to helping focus people. And I don't recall if it was you or Schreena, but in terms of like the idea of the tip of the iceberg and knowing where to look if you need more in a particular area. I would also highlight that in addition to the findings themselves, though, the learning coming out of these evaluations is one of the things that MCC staff are using the most. And, you know, one of the roles that our M&E team members play on country teams during the development process is to help bring evidence from, you know, completed evaluations to the table for consideration in the development of new programs. So that can be, you know, specific findings, that can be relevant lessons, but that is part of what we do on teams. And you know, I've been in conversations with practice leads in the Department of Compact Operations. I've been in discussions with, you know, our colleagues in Congressional and Public Affairs, and all of them kind of point to the sector results and learning pages, the evaluation briefs, the learning documents as really critical to informing our work. So yes, the evaluation papers get read, but I do think that the synthesis really does kind of help with prioritizing what folks can focus on, need to focus on, and look more deeply into.
Thanks, Algerlynn. Carson has a great question in the chat. I wonder if you want to come on and ask it, or if I should. Absolutely, Graham.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And then I
Perfect.
actually have to go a little bit early, but I wanted to note that there have been conversations recently about trying to create this enormous metadata library for impact evaluations. And, you know, I noticed that the way that the MCC database is set up, it's like amazing, by the way. I'm so happy to have an opportunity to learn more about it. And I love, I mean, it's clear that it has a lot of value and uses in terms of building accountability and enabling projects like the one that we heard about from Urtina. And I'm wondering if you all have thought about taking it to the next level of actually trying to standardize some of the effect sizes from the data. Maybe it's just too small a number of projects, but it occurs to me that if combined with a lot of other evidence across the development research community, it could be an even more valuable resource for those looking to do meta-analyses or searching for evidence based on, for example, was looking to drive certain outcomes related to education. Let's say they could look at alternative interventions and see how the hopefully standardized costs and effect sizes compare, and then make decisions based on that. So have you all thought about standardizing things like intervention costs and effect sizes, and then also how would you think about plugging all of this really rich information that you have into a larger aggregation effort?
Thank you, Carson. I think probably all of our panelists have thoughts on this. So who would like to offer reflections first?
I can start to say we've thought about some pieces of that. We haven't gone so far as to talk about like standardizing, looking at standardization of costs or effect sizes, but we have thought about, similar to the way that the sector results and learning pages are trying to help focus people to evidence that is useful for them. We've thought about, you know, is there more we can do to think about like tagging things by outcomes or particular metrics that we looked at in an evaluation, or more specifics around the types of interventions that we were measuring and things like that, similar to kind of, you know, an evidence gap map type of thing. that I think is a long, long way off. We think it would add a lot of value. And all I can say is, yes, we've thought about it, but it's not something that we are like, we don't have a work plan to get there just yet, but we recognize like that could take things to another level. So just to say, yes, I don't know, folks, I'd love to hear from anyone else though.
I might jump in, but as a non-MCC person, but you know, we definitely have talked about this over the years. And I think when I was back with MCC and with BITS, you know, this was like the greatest intersection. And I was aware of aid grade, Ava Vivalt's work that was occurring at the same time. And I am not sure if everyone will agree here, but I think that there needs to be some agreement that there's some kind of roles and responsibilities and one place can't do it all. And what I mean by that is our conversations in MCC when we're talking about standardization and what is it that needs to be produced, a focus was on evaluation briefs, learning, you know, how do we get a stronger feedback loop within the decision makers that are within the MCC circle, right? But the standardization discussions were, okay, what's our standardization requirements for what's presented by an evaluation team, by the research team in their final evaluation reports? You know, working towards standards of reporting that they are responsible for so that the products, the knowledge products out of these studies can be used by other researchers to do the meta-analysis or to do the aggregation that you're referring to. I don't mean to say or contradict like that it's off the books for MCC to do it, but I do think that, you know, MCC is a producer, a funder and the evaluation contractors are the producers of this knowledge. And I think efforts like what Ava, you know, and others maybe are doing with aid grade and these sort of meta-analysis projects, they're the consumers to take from that, right? And so it's just about maybe better matching what is produced with what, you know, is needed for that sort of work, but it's not necessarily, you know, in the scope of MCC in its little, you know, kind of universe, which is small, right? To like necessarily do it all, I guess, is what I would try to put out there.
Thanks, Jen. I know we have 2 minutes left, so I want to give the mic to Urtina and Schreena if you have 30 seconds of kind of final thoughts for the panel, and then I'll turn it back to Fernando to close us out.
Thank you, Casey. I do agree with Jennifer that each institution has a role to play into making the data usable. I was just thinking as you were speaking on how Kosovo might, for example, use the compacts, the data on the compacts that you have on energy for its own policy recommendations. And it's just when we write out these policy memos for our decision makers, we actually go to visit the neighboring country and ask them more qualitative questions on how they, for example, tackle this policy issue. But if we have access, now that we know that we have access to microdata and data sets for other developing country, we can make some small studies, let's say, inferential statistics on trying to explain main variables and trying to use the knowledge from other countries that we can't necessarily travel to get the qualitative information that we rely on as a country to develop policies. So it sort of brings us closer to countries that we don't have a lot of access to, but it's upon us how we use the information to turn them into policies. Because maybe I'm interested in a variable that Albania or Macedonia is not. So publishing the data in this manner gives even more flexibility to different countries to exploit the data differently.
Just very quickly, I'll just say if anyone anyone who's marveling at MCC's current state and thinking like, man, how do you get there? Like it was long. It was a long and kind of step-by-step incremental process. We didn't just magically get to this point. It's been at least a decade, and there was more thinking, I'm sure, before 2012 on some of the foundational building blocks to generating evidence. And so I would just say, and like I said before, I think it's like taking each piece and then really being clear about what you're trying to achieve with each piece, whether it's the evidence generation and then the publication, and then possibly getting to a meta-analysis and evidence gap map. I think it's all just kind of an iterative process, just building on each layer as you go along.
Well, thank you very much for this great panel, and thank you again for the Templeton Foundation for supporting us in this research seminar. Be on the lookout for our newsletter. You will find the links for this recording session and others from the Open Research Seminar. And thank you again and for this great work and for the audience. Have a good day.
Thank you.